My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now resume.
The question is that the House do now resume. As many as are of that opinion will say content.
Content.
The contrary not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, the next debate is time limited to 90 minutes and all backbench contributions will be limited to 10 minutes each.
Lord Singh of Wimbledon.
My Lords, the first week of June will mark the 30th anniversary of the Indian government's attack on the Golden Temple, the Vatican of Sikhs. The attack was deliberately timed to coincide with the martyrdom anniversary of the temple's founder, Guru Arjan, when the huge complex would be full to overflowing with pilgrims. Tanks and armoured vehicles were used, and on conservative estimates, well over 2,000 pilgrims were killed. Eyewitnesses told of how some who surrendered were tied up with their own turbans and shot. Other eyewitnesses outside the temple complex, including my own in-laws, described with horror how they saw groups of pilgrims being herded together and then dispatched with hand grenades. Many of the atrocities were reported in the British and world press. The President of India at the time, Zal Singh, a Sikh, was nominal head of India's armed services, and he was not even consulted. Every June, Sikhs remember the huge loss of life and the mindless damage to the Golden Temple, the historic centre of the Sikh faith. And the question arises, why did Indira Gandhi resort to such brute force against the Sikhs? The Indian government version, unquestioningly accepted by our government, and I speak as a British Sikh, was that there were 17 wanted separatists, to use the Indian government's jargon, holed up in the Golden Temple. And they were a threat to a country of 1 billion people. The absurdity is obvious, nor does it explain why 40 other historic gurdwaras in Punjab were attacked at the same time. Sikh gurdwaras, my lords, are open to all. Why weren't the so-called separatists simply arrested by the hundreds of soldiers and police who daily entered the Gurdwara for the traditional free food? My lords, what Sikhs were demanding at the time was a fair share of Punjab's river waters to irrigate their fields, and more importantly, fair treatment for all of India's minorities against growing evidence of majority bigotry. Earlier in the same year, hundreds of Muslims in Mumbai were massacred with a mob carrying banners proclaiming majorities have their rights. The true reason for Mrs. Gandhi's vindictive attitude to Sikhs stemmed from her prison conviction for electoral fraud in the election of 1975, her seizing power and imposing dictatorial rule. Her son Sanjay had married a Sikh, and she turned to Sikhs for support. Sikhs, though less than 2% of the population, were at the forefront of opposition to dictatorial rule, in which the poor, particularly Muslims, were forcibly sterilized, and others dumped in the wilderness to make Delhi a tidier place for the Asian Games. Maneka Gandhi, Sanjay's wife, true to Sikh democratic traditions, openly opposed the dictatorships. Sikhs were never forgiven by Mrs. Gandhi. When she returned to office, she cynically decided to play to majority religious bigotry, first against the Muslims, and then even more vindictively against Sikhs. My lords, the June 84 carnage in the Golden Temple far exceeded in numbers and barbarity the 1919 General Dyer-led massacre at nearby Jallianwala Bagh. But even worse was to come. The widespread killing of thousands of Sikhs following Mrs. Gandhi's assassination was blamed on spontaneous mob violence. All evidence is that it was pre-planned for the anniversary of Guru Nanak's birthday. It was simply brought forward with the government-controlled All India Radio constantly inciting the killers with the words, "Khoon ka badla khoon," that is, they take blood for blood. The army was confined to barracks for 3 full days to allow free rein to organized gangs carrying Sikh voters' lists and armed with identical steel rods and an unusually plentiful supply of kerosene to go around the capital in municipal buses, beating and burning male Sikhs and gang-raping women and young girls. Prominent Hindus and Sikhs begged the new Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, to order troops to restore order. His chilling response was, "When a big tree falls, the ground is bound to shake." The same scenes were enacted throughout the country. We know all about the disappearances and killings in General Pinochet's Chile. A WikiLeaks document carrying a signed report from the American Embassy in India shows that more Sikhs were brutally murdered in just 3 days in 1984 than those killed in General Pinochet's 17-year rule. My Lords, let me now turn to our government's involvement as revealed in documents that have now come to light. In its initial reaction, the present government said support from Mrs. Gandhi was minimal. I beg the government to think again. In the light of evidence of persecution of Sikhs freely known at the time, a government committed to human rights must question the morality of minimal involvement in the persecution of minorities. The released documents praise Mrs. Gandhi and cast aspersions on UK Sikhs, with not one word of concern over the murder of thousands of Sikhs. My Lords, I wasn't in the least surprised to read of SAS involvement. I wrote about it at the time in the summer '84 issue of the Sikh Messenger. Nor was I surprised by evidence linking British support to Mrs. Gandhi for a £5 billion arms contract and the need to keep Mrs. Gandhi happy. In November '84, I went to see a senior cabinet minister to seek government support to end the pogrom against Sikhs. I received the reply, "Inderjit, we know exactly what's going on, but we're walking on a tightrope. We've already lost one important contract." At the time, I was a member of the UNA where we discussed the killings. The director, Malcolm Harper, formally raised evidence-based concerns with the government, asking it to support a UN inquiry into the killings. And the all-party group, and I made a presentation to the all-party group on human rights, then chaired by the noble Lord Avebury. The all-party group decided to send 2 parliamentarians to investigate. The High Commission refused them visas. They appealed, saying that the visit would help improve Hindu-Sikh relations. They were again refused. Sikhs accept that today's government is in no way responsible for the mistakes of the past, but it can and must help to heal wounds. I was in Westminster Abbey this morning and heard Archbishop Desmond Tutu quote the words, "A time for healing has come." A healing of wounds has come. This is true for the wounds in the Sikh community, opened further by the new revelations. My Lords, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank many in the Hindu community who had sheltered Sikhs at the time of the killings. Others risked their lives, carefully documenting the names of Congress Party leaders inciting mobs to kill. Sikhs owe them a great debt. My Lords, 2 of the 3 main political parties in India have declared their support for an open inquiry. Even Rahul Gandhi, leading the Congress, has admitted that some Congress officials were involved in the killings. Speaking in the Indian Parliament in 2005, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh made the revealing comment, 21 years have passed, and yet the feeling still persists that somehow the truth has not come out. My Lords, I urge the Government to add its support for an open, independent inquiry into the massacre or genocide of Sikhs in 1984, in the same way that the Government is backing a UN-led inquiry into the killing of Tamils in Sri Lanka. Against this, all offers of government assistance and offers to talk to Sikhs pales into an unnecessary distraction. 83,000 Sikhs gave their lives supporting Britain in the 2 world wars. In comparison, giving public support for an open UN-led inquiry is a small ask. Not to do so will give a clear message to Britain's 500,000 Sikhs and to others concerned with human rights that the UK government is ambivalent and selective on issues of human rights. As director of the network of Sikh organisations, the oldest and largest grouping of Sikhs in the UK, and the more recently formed Sikh Council, I offer my full and unconditional support to the government to help end the 30-year nightmare suffered by Sikhs. We are confident that our government will not let us down.
My Lords, I would like to thank the Noble Lord Singh of Wimbledon for initiating this debate. My Lords, I am close to the Sikh community and enjoy good relations with them. I am in fact a patron of 2 Sikh organizations. Sikhs play a vital part in the life and history of the United Kingdom. The first Sikh settled here 160 years ago in 1854. Since that time, waves of Sikh migrants have come here and successfully integrated into British society. My Lords, we owe them an immense debt of gratitude for fighting shoulder to shoulder with us in both world wars. They also played a key role during the post-war expansion of the British economy. They filled many jobs when Britain was experiencing a labour shortage. There are now over 500,000 Sikhs living in the United Kingdom. The British Sikh Report 2013 found that 95% of British Sikhs are proud to be born or living in the United Kingdom. They have been successful in every walk of life, which include businesses, professions, sports, academia, and in the political scenes. We are indeed pleased to see a turban Sikh in your Lordship's house today. The Sikhs have a reputation for strong work ethics and are second only to Jews in how financially productive they are as a religious group. At a reception last year to mark the harvest festival of Vaisakhi, the Prime Minister referred to Sikhs as a model community. Their values of hard work, loyalty and service to the community resonate strongly with me as a Muslim. I would like to mention there are writings of a Muslim, Sheikh Farid, in the Sikh holy book which is called the Guru Granth Sahib. We have a proud tradition in the UK of accepting and welcoming those from other cultures and of other religions. Nowhere has this been truer than with the Sikh community. The academic Dr. Jasjit Singh has noted that British Sikhs are more comfortable with wearing turbans than those in other countries. I find that more Sikhs are now wearing turbans which they did not do before. Although the Sikhs are well settled and happily integrated in the British community, there is unease within the community relating to the Operation Bluestar. My Lords, the events of June 1984 should and will never be forgotten. The bloodshed and loss of life was, as the Foreign Secretary himself said, an utter tragedy. Estimates on number of deaths range from the hundreds to the thousands, including innocent pilgrims caught in the crossfire. It will forever be remembered as a horrific point in the history that caused long-lasting suffering and desecrated Sikhism's holiest place of worship. It was therefore only right that it was revisited when the documents of disclosure were published under the 30-year rule. I would like to acknowledge the swift and proactive nature with which our government dealt with these revelations. The Prime Minister immediately instructed the Cabinet Secretary to carry out an investigation, and I commend him for doing this. The Foreign Secretary has assured us that the investigation was both rigorous and thorough, and I have no reason to doubt this. The report was clear. The UK's assistance was purely advisory in context and very limited in volume. When the actual military operation took place several months later, it differed vastly from the original plans. We can therefore be confident that there was little, if any, connection with the British advice and the disastrous events that eventually unfolded. However, the resonance of this investigation with today's Sikh community cannot be underestimated. Continued suspicion and a desire for disclosure was inevitable, and we must sympathize and deal with this appropriately. As the Prime Minister himself has said, the scars in the Sikh community still run deep. I know from my connection with the community that there are Sikhs asking for further action, namely holding of an independent inquiry. Given the circumstances, it is of paramount importance that the government is seen to be reaching out to and working with the Sikh community. I do believe the role of Sikhs in our country is generally well acknowledged and respected. David Cameron was the first British Prime Minister to visit the Golden Temple. I am aware that the leader of the opposition is visiting this week, as have a number of other parliamentarians. My Lords, I have personally visited the Golden Temple on 3 occasions, where I was received with a great deal of courtesy and respect. It must be borne in mind that the foundation stone of the Golden Temple was in fact laid by a Muslim whose name was Mir Amir. The Sikhs, of course, believe that no one should interfere in the wearing of turbans by them, and I am pleased that this government ended the manual searches of the turbans at airports. I know this move was very welcome. My Lords, our commitment to the Sikh community go hand in hand with our commitment to uncovering the truth. My Lords, I would ask my noble friend the Minister if she can address the point relating to holding of an independent inquiry. As I have said previously, there are Sikhs in the United Kingdom who are asking for this to take place. My Lords, in any event, all proceedings must be conducted with utmost transparency and accountability at its heart.
My Lords, I thank my honourable friend Lord Singh for securing this debate. My Lords, I am aware of an almost unanimous outcry of the Sikh community all over the world on the invasion of the Golden Temple by the Indian Armed Forces in 1984. This was a tragic event that resulted in loss of thousands of innocent lives that could have been avoided. The recent release of the report by the UK government regarding the attack on the Sri Harmandir Sahib Golden Temple complex has raised more questions on the British involvement in this operation. I have had long discussions with Sikh leaders, including my friend and colleague Paramjit Singh Gill, a former member and one of the 5 Sikhs ever elected to the other house. He has been working robustly on the issue both before the release of the report and after. I believe, along with other Sikh leaders, he has met with some of the most senior people in the government, including Cabinet Secretary, the Deputy Prime Minister, and Baroness Shaida Warsi. My Lords, on behalf of the British Sikh community, may I raise the following points. Number 1, the Cabinet Secretary had reported that a key file on the provision of the military advice to the Indian authorities on their plans for the attack in June 1984 was destroyed by the Ministry of the Defence in November 2009. It remains unclear why such an important file was destroyed, and this lessens the credibility of the internal inquiry. Given the incredible importance of the 1984 attack on the Sikh faith, who took the decision to destroy the files, and how was that decision taken? Was it at the ministerial level? Number 2, Parliament appeared to have been misled at the time. Following a question on 30th July 1984 by then MP for Slough, John Watts, he asked the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, and I quote, "What discussions Her Majesty's Government have had with the Government of India about this incident," referring to the attack on Sri Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple. Ray Whitney, then Parliamentary Under Secretary, replied that, and I quote, "The Foreign and Commonwealth Office has received petitions and numerous letters from the Sikh community in the UK about the recent events in Punjab. As this matter is an internal Indian matter, we have not sought to discuss it with the Indian government." Unquote. Isn't this contrary to the fact now established that they were in discussions and had provided military advice? Number 3, the media had reported in January 2014 that the Prime Minister had ordered an inquiry to be carried out by the Cabinet Secretary which would cover the events of 1984. The inquiry covered only a period up to the start of the attack and no other events, which included the genocide of Sikhs that followed later that year. Clearly, the parameters of the review were too narrow, and it has been alleged that the terms of reference, which had not been published, had changed during the inquiry. Would it not have made sense if the inquiry was to carry the confidence of the Sikh community to review and release all documents covering the 1984 events and over a much broader period of time, including the genocide of Sikhs in 1984? Despite the review and report, why have the details of the specified advice given not been revealed, and the reason not been disclosed, and why the UK government agreed to advise the Indian government on how to attack the Sikhs' holiest shrine? Number 4, when the Foreign Secretary delivered his statement in the other place on the 4th of February 2014, members raised questions suggesting that defence-related commercial interests have been advanced on the basis of providing advice to India, and also measures were taken by the UK government to stop Sikhs in the UK from exercising their democratic rights to hold peaceful gatherings in the UK. Would the Minister please comment on that? Number 5, what sanctions, if any, did the Government of India threaten the UK with in order to secure its silence when a genocide of Sikhs was taking place in India in 1984? And finally, my Lords, given the gravity of the decision taken by the UK government of 30 years before to provide military advice to the Indian authorities, which led to the series of events resulting in thousands of innocent Sikhs losing their lives, the very least the estimated 500,000 Sikhs in the UK are entitled to from this government is a full, independent, judge-led public inquiry, so the truth can finally come out. Can my honourable friend, the Minister, promise a full, independent, judge-led public inquiry to establish the facts about the extent of the British involvement in the Golden Temple invasion to satisfy the British Sikh community?
My Lords, Lord Singh has spoken eloquently of the terrible events that took place 30 years ago. Some 7 years in the 1990s, I was privileged to live in Walsall in the West Midlands, in a very multicultural area where I was then working and ministering. And I counted among my friends not only a Sikh family who lived next door to me, but I also paid many visits to the local Guru Nanak temple and received wonderful hospitality there. And so even at that point, some 10 years after the events of Operation Bluestar, Operation Sundown and Operation Woodrose, I was aware just of how large these tragedies were looming in the imagination, but not just the imagination, in the actual families of those who were my neighbours. These weren't events which had simply taken place in some remote area. These were events which deeply affected people who lived around me. And it was compounded because some of the worst of the atrocities took place at the holiest site for Sikhs. So I'm acutely aware of the pain, the anguish and the consternation that many of my Sikh friends feel. And I do want to identify with something of that, and aware of just how difficult it is for them and what they're feeling at the moment as British citizens, having learnt that their own government provided advice, military advice, not long before Operation Bluestar. And I'm not surprised that they're asking a lot of questions as they're trying to reflect on what happened. Now, during that period back in the 1990s, when I lived on the edge of the blank country, I was also able to undertake some empirical research as part of a degree I was doing into the Sikh community. And it was fascinating. That research revealed that young Sikhs at that point in the West Midlands were a group with some of the highest levels of motivation and ambition compared with their peers. They were achieving some excellent results in their exams. In other words, these were young people who were making a real and tangible contribution, not only to our society and our economy, but incidentally their families were also making a huge contribution to their wider families back in their country of origin. Now, we know from other ethnic minority and minority religious groups in this country that sometimes an event can be so significant, or to use a rather overused word, so iconic, that they can become catalysts for the radicalisation of a minority of their followers. Fortunately, there are a few signs that this is happening in the Sikh community at the moment. But there is a real danger that that could happen. And it is significant, I think, as already been pointed out by Lord Singh, that the latest revelations have emerged in the 30th anniversary year, which adds a great poignancy to our deliberations this evening. I do, however, want to acknowledge the role of the Foreign Secretary, who's played in this matter, for his clear commitment to transparency, for the investigation that's already taken place, for his statement, and for his commitment to the ongoing dialogue. And that's important that it continues. Nevertheless, I do think in this case there are reasons why we need some sort of wider inquiry about what went on. We do need to ensure that if there are other areas where there is any complicity, not least between our government and the Indian government, that it's acknowledged. And if we are going to claim the moral high ground of believing in open government, and if we do want our Sikh brothers and sisters to know that they are fully part of our nation and their contribution is still valued, then I believe we do need to take a further look into this and have some sort of wider inquiry. I think if we fail to do it, and fail to do everything we can to address the serious concerns being expressed by all sections of the Sikh community, and it's a widespread concern, if we don't do that, there's a real danger of long-term damage to our excellent, outstanding community relationships that have been built up over such a long period of time. And I hope we can try and find some way forward to give deeper reassurance to our Sikh brothers and sisters.
My Lords, I too want to thank the Noble Lord Singh for securing today's debate, and I want to state that I have very much enjoyed getting to know the Noble Lord, who is a fellow officer in the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Freedom of Religion or Belief, and he brings a significant voice from the Sikh community to our plural public debate. But I have to say that when he began to tell me about the implications of the documents that have been released, I was actually surprised that there could have been any connection. That may reflect the fact that I was not perhaps old enough to be conscious of the seriousness of the events at the time, but I was surprised to learn that there had been this type of involvement. But in many ways, the title of this debate saddens me, as the hundreds of thousands of British people in the Sikh community have been such a good example of integration, with many successful businesses, involvement in politics with Paul Uppal MP in the House of Commons, and the England cricket team is of course in need of another Monty Panesar to rescue our performance at the moment. But there are also an exemplar of how there has been reasonable accommodation of their religious beliefs in UK law. Section 11 of the Employment Act 1989 exempts turban-wearing Sikhs from any requirements to wear safety helmets on construction sites or to wear crash helmets. And, of course, the kirpan, the ceremonial knife, is exempted under the Criminal Justice Act 1988 if it's carried for religious reasons. But, my Lords, the news coverage of this matter reveals that the relationship now between the UK government and the Sikh community is strained, and reconciliation is needed. And despite the attempts by the first inquiry, it seems we're not where we would like to be. Any relationship needs the parties to trust each other, and that in this scenario depends on openness. After reading various reports, it is clear that the disclosure of the documents in January of this year was inadvertent. Namely, this was disclosure of information that the UK government had decided would always remain secret. And I think it's important that Her Majesty's government has been clear about this, as this is an important starting point for considering matters and restoring the relationship. In this scenario, it seems that the Ministry of Defence made a mistake in that they didn't destroy all the files that they should have done, and that at the 25-year point, copies were left. So although the Cabinet Secretary's report has pieced together the material from the copies left in other government files, it has inevitably left a lingering and damaging suspicion that not all the documents needed were in fact available to the inquiry. It's partly, I'm sure, but ensuring that this doesn't happen again in the future, that Her Majesty's government has instituted an inquiry into the disclosure under the 30 or soon to be 20-year rule. And as a matter of practicality, at 25 years, should the files actually be destroyed, or wouldn't it be sensible to wait until 30 years has passed to now make sure that we're not in the future inadvertently placed in this position again, and that the files remain to be considered if needed? So the situation we have is where these documents were never intended to be disclosed, as the decision was made that they would reveal information relating to intelligence or special forces. This situation would mean that the destruction of all of the files in 2009 was appropriate, and of course all the copies in the other files should have been destroyed. As I say, I'm pleased that there's a commission looking into the annual release of papers and the process for withholding information. But as this was an inadvertent disclosure, we have a rare window into the decisions that are made on the basis of military and special forces destruction of information. Will this commission have any remit to receive views from the public and interested bodies, particularly the Sikh community, on whether this kind of information should actually have been available for disclosure after 30 years? Is there not an advantage from such an inadvertent disclosure to have public debate on whether the line of non-disclosure is actually being drawn in the right place? I note at this point there has been no crying from the government in terms of an Edward Snowden type situation, that we've got all kinds of security implications because we know about what in fact happened 30 years ago. But if it's not going to be part of the Commission's work, could Her Majesty's Government advise whether the Intelligence and Security Committee could have a remit to consider this issue? The relational problems are perhaps being exacerbated by the Cabinet Secretary on behalf of Her Majesty's Government investigating the previous behaviour of Her Majesty's Government. Would not the ISC, who are a parliamentary committee, be more neutrally placed to look into this matter to allay the fears of additional documentation being available that such an inadvertent disclosure has created? I'm afraid I'm not currently persuaded of the need for a full inquiry, but I completely understand the feelings of the Sikh community in lacking trust in their government in this regard. It seems, as I say, that they were never intended to know this information, which leads to legitimate concerns for the community of what else does the government know, and questions as to why they should not have known this information after 30 years. As I'm sure Her Majesty's Government realises, it is one thing to express your apologies for the deaths of community members at the hands of a foreign government. It is quite another type of apology and restoration that is needed if you have involvement, albeit very limited, perhaps ineffective involvement, but involvement nonetheless in the actions of a foreign government in these types of matters. Undoing this relational damage is going to be difficult, but I struggle to see how this relationship can be fully restored unless the question is answered of why, after 30 years, the community could not in any event have known this information. Finally, my lords, I note that the Indian government are looking into this matter again, and could my noble friend the Minister indicate whether the UN are looking at holding some form of inquiry into this matter? I strongly support an international inquiry, and if that is something that Her Majesty's Government could support, that would do something to improve relationships. I do sympathise with Her Majesty's Government due to this inadvertent disclosure, as restoring the relationship with the Sikh community is not going to be straightforward. And I do hope they will be able to do this whether in the manner I've outlined with the ISC or through to another vehicle, as otherwise the views of political parties, and I await to hear with interest the views from the benches opposite, on a full public inquiry could well become in May 2015 what political strategists, I believe, call a wedge issue for voters.
My Lords, I join everybody in thanking Lord Singh, not just for securing the debate, for the moving, careful and thoughtful way in which he introduced it. I appreciated that greatly, as I did Lord Sheikh's valuable history and its full recognition of the contribution of the Sikh community, which I thought was again very moving. Like him, I visited the Golden Temple, and it's an inspiring and deeply religious place. You feel the depth of belief. People sometimes say that dreadful events occurred at a different time in our history when different understandings of what normality was held sway. This is not such a case. No such argument, in my view, is available. A massacre is a massacre, and it was in the midst of many other outrages against the Sikh people. And people are entitled to know, with as much certainty as is possible, what happened and why, who was involved and with what level of culpability. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, mentioned also Sundown and other events, and they all contribute to the knowledge which we need. And Her Majesty's Government must today understand this feeling among the Sikh community, not for any reasons to do with 2015, but because it is needed, it is right, that they have a plain entitlement to know what happened and why. The nature of the terrible events at Amritsar in 1984 doesn't only affect the Sikh community, it affects all of us. It affects our country, it affects our sense of decency in the values that we hold for ourselves as well as in that community. Baroness Berridge has made a point which I think is of great importance. This was an inadvertent disclosure. It was always intended to be a permanent secret. Whatever the pain that would cause, a pain which could have been alleviated, but which it was intended should not be, because of secrecy. It's been said that the Indian government at the time turned to the United Kingdom because through the experience of Balcombe Street and other sieges we had relevant experience. Well, be that as it may, Balcombe Street and Amritsar look to me to be very, very different, and the consequences hugely different. The study by the Cabinet Secretary, published recently, states that he studied 23,000 documents in 200 files. He reports key documents were destroyed as, I quote him, part of a routine process, unquote, at the 25-year review point. Lord Hussain has also made the point about why some documents were destroyed. I share that view with him. The Cabinet Secretary concluded that we did nothing more in respect of Operation Bluestar than provide limited military advice. I'm surprised that such a conclusion can be reached given the documents that are missing, because they would have added great clarity. If he is so confident of these facts, it seems to me that he should not be. There is an information gap which requires further investigation. Sir Jeremy Hayward notes the high level of the request for assistance that was received. Mrs. Gandhi, it is said, would not have understood a failure to help. But he concludes that the assistance, the advice, was not subsequently taken. Indeed, he concludes everyone thought our advice and assistance was insufficient and insignificant. At para 19 of his report, he notes that Mrs. Gandhi's letter to Mrs. Thatcher of the 14th of June 1984 made no reference to UK assistance at all. And at paragraph 20 he notes the military commander at Amritsar, Lieutenant General Brar, said no one had helped in planning or execution. This is seen by Sir Jeremy as compelling evidence of the United Kingdom's minimal role. I find this nothing like as compelling as he appears to. Least of all, it is untested by the kind of full inquiry that is plainly needed on this occasion. And in the remarkable absence of Mrs. Thatcher's letter to Mrs. Gandhi, where is that letter and what does it say? Sir Jeremy may be right, but it is just as probable that the documents, the historical trail, was intended on this occasion to show how little the United Kingdom's involvement was, because it was thought that that was the best way of describing our approach. It is just as probable that a proud nation like India, with a proud military commander, wanted to confirm the strength of their sovereign role and capability without making any reference to anybody else. Such possibilities are commonplace in the relations between nations at this level. It is not fanciful on the evidence that Sir Jeremy himself looked at that other conclusions might be drawn. Sir Jeremy's final assertion, I fear, is rather too shallow to remain unchallenged. All of this flows to his conclusions at paragraph 23. He is an exceptional civil servant, and I will always say so. But the conclusions are far from beyond challenge. An inquiry is the right place for a challenging examination. Nothing less will commend itself to the Sikh community or indeed to the rest of us. Missing documents, insecure conclusions, a failure to grasp context do not inspire confidence. The documents which are available do provide some context, however. Many expressing concern, in those documents, many express concern about the denigration of anybody who had anything to say about the matter as extremists. And Her Majesty's government did do that at the time. The view of Sikhs and other supporters of Mrs. Thatcher's government would, I believe, regard what was said then as intolerable if it was said today. It should have been intolerable when it was said at the time. This was, and still is, a remarkable community. Its offence was to object to a sequence of events and finally to a massacre of a large number of its members. It was perfectly entitled to object in those terms. And what is more, researchers at Kew have found documents believed to be missing, and some are still missing, documents bearing on the gaps which I've tried to describe as other noble lords have today. It's regrettable that our call for all the relevant documents being placed in the public domain and for a list of those interviewed by Sir Jeremy is as yet not forthcoming. I regret the narrowness and limited time frame in Sir Jeremy's terms of reference, and again Lord Hussein made the point very forcibly. So tonight is, in my view, my lords, something of a watershed. This is not a small debate at the end of a busy day. Her Majesty's government cannot, I think, tonight sidestep the issues. An independent public inquiry is needed. Agree to it tonight, and agree to it with good grace. It will be forced on the government, legally or by the outrage of the community. So rather than that, do it because it's right, and it's inevitable. Take credit for doing the right thing. Will the Minister give us a positive answer to that tonight? Will the Minister agree to sufficiently wide terms of reference and an appropriate time period to allow this to be investigated properly? When will the Prime Minister respond on these matters to the 2nd of February letter from the Sikh Federation of the United Kingdom? When will their letter of the 12th of February, setting out the fault lines in the Cabinet Secretary's report, receive a reply? When will the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary meet the representatives of the Federation in order to ensure that progress can be made? Does the Minister accept that answers on whether Parliament was misled on the 30th of July 1984 have been misleading, have been based on what I can only describe as a somewhat deceitful piece of sophistry? Will she simply acknowledge that error? Will the United Kingdom's military advisor's report, provided to the Indian government on the 13th of February 1984, be shared with Parliament so that Parliament can assess whether the United Kingdom's advice was taken or not? And if it's thought that it's too sensitive, will that be provided through the Intelligence and Security Committee, as has also been discussed tonight? I think all noble lords who've spoken so far believe there should be some form of inquiry. In the case of Baroness Berridge, I think an international body rather than a UK one, but generally I think we've all thought of a UK one. And I hope that the government will respond to that positively. Because finally, I think the government will have to apologise and should apologise to the Sikh community, and then explore with that community a positive act of reconciliation. It's time this was resolved.
My Lords, I'm grateful to the Noble Lord Singh for securing this evening's debate and of course his patience for waiting until the end of the evening for this debate to be heard. And I agree with the Noble Lord Treisman that this is not a debate which should simply be seen as something that happened at the end of a day, but should also be seen as the tragedy that was what happened at Amritsar 30 years ago, that led to the tragic loss of life, and that must never be forgotten. I understand that the pain and suffering that these events inflicted on the Sikh community is still being deeply felt both in the United Kingdom and around the world, and it was in deference to that strength of feeling that when on the 13th of January 2 documents published by the National Archives appeared to indicate that the then British government had sent a military advisor to the Indian government in the early stages of the crisis, that my right honourable friend the Prime Minister ordered an immediate inquiry. The investigation was treated with the utmost urgency and seriousness, and the process has been made as transparent as possible, and its findings have been made public. And as I made clear to the House on the 4th of February, and my right honourable friend the Foreign Secretary made equally clear in the other place, following the exhaustive review of over 23,000 documents, the Cabinet Secretary concluded that the UK's assistance was purely advisory, limited in both timescale and scope, and was provided at an early stage and consequently had limited impact on events. No further information has emerged to suggest possible UK involvement in any other military operations in India in 1984. On the same day, my Lords, as the Cabinet Secretary's report was published, my right honourable friend, the Minister of State for India, and my parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government met Sikh representatives to discuss the findings of the report and to listen to their concerns. And I understand that the Noble Lord Singh was at that meeting. The meeting coincided with the statement in your Lordship's House, and I was thus not present. However, in my dual role at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and at DCLG, I met the Noble Lord and other Sikh representatives last week to listen to the views of community members who have now had 3 weeks to examine the Cabinet Secretary's report. My Lords, at that meeting a number of issues were discussed and a number of issues were raised, including those that have been raised in your Lordship's House today. And can I address each of these in turn? My noble friend Lord Hussain asked a number of specific questions, and I hope I'm addressing those too in dealing with these issues. First of all, on the focus of the investigation, and whether the focus of the investigation changed. My Lords, from the outset, the investigation looked at the circumstantial evidence that came to light on specific allegations of UK involvement in Operation Bluestar. As my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, made clear in the House on the 4th of February, the Cabinet Secretary has not turned up in producing the report other circumstantial evidence that we think requires such investigation. Of course, we do not know what evidence will ever be turned up in future, but we cannot rule out all investigations. So we cannot rule out all investigations for the future. The Noble Lord Hussain specifically asked why the investigation didn't look at events after, other than those in 1984. My Lords, the search did not extend to any other time frame, such as 1986 or 1988, when, for example, Operation Black Thunder was undertaken. However, there was no indication from the file searched that there was any UK role in these. My Lords, on the allegation that the decision to provide advice may have been linked to UK commercial interests, the report found no evidence to substantiate this allegation. The investigation did not find any evidence in the files or from officials of the provision of UK military advice being linked to potential defence or helicopter sales, or to any other policy or commercial issue. There is no evidence that the UK at any level attempted to use the fact that military advice had been given on request to advance any commercial objectives. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, mentioned other operations. Operation Sundown, I think, was one that he referred to. To quote from the report, recent Indian media reports suggest the operational plan developed by the Indian interlocutors of the UK military advisor was called Sundown and focused on detaining Brindawala, the leader of the Sikh dissidents occupying Sri Harmandir Sahib. There is no mention of Operation Sundown in UK files, nor do those interviewed recall that name, nor was the UK military advisor's report of February focused on a snatch operation. It was designed to re-establish control over the temple complex. It is, of course, possible that Indian planning went through several iterations after the UK military advisor's visit and report. The Noble Lord Hussain asked whether we would publish the UK military officers' advice. It would not, my Lords, be in the interest of national security to release the tactical details of specialist military advice, and it's not something that successive governments have done. The Noble Lord Singh and my noble friend Lord Sheikh asked and called for an international inquiry. On the calls for this international inquiry, my Lords, the purpose of the Cabinet Secretary's investigation was to establish the extent of UK government involvement in the Indian government's plans for military operations, not the operation itself or the actions of the Indian government. That, my Lords, is a matter for the Indian authorities. And the Noble Lord Treesman did talk about a number of hypothetical interpretations of what the documents could have been trying to suggest. My Lords, I would say that the report focused on what the documents actually said, and it's upon that basis that the report was written. My noble friend Lord Hussain asked about whether Parliament was misled at the time of Operation Bluestar, given the then PUS's comments to a written answer in July 1984 that the UK had not sought to discuss the operation with the Indian government. The Cabinet Secretary states the following in his report to the Prime Minister on this issue, and I quote, my Lords, "My view is that the parliamentary question and Mr Whitney's reply were almost certainly directed at the question of UK-Indian discussions post the storming of the Sri Harmandir Sahib, and therefore in this context Mr Whitney did not mislead Parliament. This is reinforced by the fact that neither Mr Whitney nor his office were copied any of the relevant papers on the UK military officer's earlier visit in February, which was treated as top secret. Mr Whitney is now deceased." My noble friend Lord Hussain and my noble friend Lady Berridge asked why some relevant documents were destroyed. Some military files, my Lords, on various operations were destroyed in November of 2009. This included one on the provision of military advice to the Indian authorities on their contingency plans for Harmandir Sahib. I understand that this was part of a routine process undertaken by the MOD at the 25-year review point. The decision to destroy files is made on a case-by-case basis, assessing relevance to ongoing operations and the broader historic significance. In this instance, it was not felt necessary to preserve that particular file. I can assure my noble friend Lady Berridge that we are determined to look at the wider issues raised by these events about the management and release of information held by government. Under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, the 30-year rule has been superseded by a 20-year rule that my noble friend refers to, so that as from 2022 all annual releases will be after 20 years. However, it is not clear at the moment that this change is being approached in a uniform fashion by all departments, and the Prime Minister has therefore decided to commission a review to establish the position across government on the annual release of papers and the ability and readiness of departments to meet the requirements of moving to the 20-year rule, including the processes for withholding information. This review is being carried out by the Prime Minister's independent advisor on ministerial standards, Sir Alex Allen. As part of the Cabinet Secretary's review, relevant departments have also searched their files for papers covering the handling of events in Amritsar from December 1983 through to the end of 1984. Some files extended into 1985. But it's important to remember that established processes set out in long-standing legislation, is that it is not the date of each document that determines the release date, but the date of the last document on a file. So there will inevitably be other documents on India from 1984 in subsequent tranches of releases. But we are confident that we have secured all papers to do with UK advice on the tragic events in Amritsar in 1984. The Noble Lord Treesman refers specifically to the Lady Thatcher Mrs Gandhi letter. It was released as part of public release in the National Archives, so that is actually in the public domain. In relation to wider context on the issue of concerns to the Sikh community, the community meeting that I had at which the Noble Lord Singh was present discussed broader issues, including the way in which the British Sikh community is perceived now, was perceived at the time of the events in 1984. And I stressed to him at that time that I believe that the working relationship between the government and the Sikh community on domestic issues has been a good one, that the Department for Communities and Local Government have engaged on a number of issues, and indeed being advised by the community have had some great successes. The wearing of the turban through airports, for example, and the use of swabs as opposed to the way in which it's done in some of the other European Union countries, for example, has been one of those. I know the Ministry of Justice is engaged on a whole series of issues with the British Sikh community. as is the Government Equalities Office around legislation on equalities and human rights. But I understand, my lords, that whatever the relationship is with the British Sikh community, this issue remains one which raises huge concern. And it's why I said to the noble lord, and indeed to the community representatives at the time, that if there are specific questions which remain, and clearly some have been raised today, then it is for officials to see what we can do in relation to responding to those. I laid out a series of action points at the end of that meeting, and I will certainly be writing to the Sikh Council, who appointed themselves really as the convener of that meeting and as a way of communicating back to the community. I will make sure that copies of that correspondence is sent back to the noble Lord, Lord Singh, and I will make sure that the conversation between the government and the British Sikh community continues. My lords, in conclusion, the families of those who were killed at Sri Harmandir Sahib have had to live with the hurt and pain of that day for 3 decades, and the pain of their loss is clearly and understandably still keenly felt. The suggestion that the British government may have had a hand in the tragedy will have understandably shaken the Sikh community, a group which makes such a valuable and positive contribution to our society. However, this government, perhaps more than any other, has recognised the need for honesty and transparency when it comes to the darker moments of our past, and that's why, when concerns were raised, we took instant action. All of the evidence has been properly and thoroughly examined. And the Cabinet Secretary's investigation and the published report have made clear a number of things: that the UK's assistance was limited, it was purely advisory, that it had limited impact on the tragic events that unfolded at the temple 3 months later, that the advice was not given in exchange for any commercial gain, and there is no record of the British government receiving advance notice of the operation. I know that the events of 30 years ago will continue to be deeply distressing for all those whose lives they touched, but I hope that this investigation and the open manner in which it has been conducted will provide some reassurance to the Sikh community, to this House and to the public. And I am once again grateful for the noble Lord for providing the opportunity for us to discuss this matter today.
My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn.